Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her during last month's staffing meeting, his voice smooth as polished marble. He didn't know she'd survived 6 hours alone in a combat field hospital while mortar rounds shook the ceiling. He didn't know her hands had held a severed femoral artery closed with nothing but gauze and prayer while a 19-year-old Marine screamed. He didn't know that in the Hindu Kush, they called her Valkyrie. What he did know was that Katie Rodriguez was getting in his way, asking too many questions about his opioid requisitions, and that made her a problem to be solved. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to happen. Katie arrived at St. Michael's Children's Hospital in Raleigh at 5:41 a.m., 32 minutes before her shift officially began. The parking lot was empty except for a custodian pushing a grey mop bucket toward the service entrance. She sat in her 2008 Honda Civic for 3 minutes, breathing, centering herself the way they'd taught her at Langley before deploying undercover. Air Force intelligence had placed her here 6 weeks ago to monitor a suspected opioid diversion ring. Dr. Marcus Pierce, the attending physician for pediatric ICU, had been flagged in a DEA audit. His opioid requisitions were 340% above the regional average for a hospital this size. But Katie had discovered something else in those 6 weeks. Something that made her skin crawl every time she saw his face. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the staff entrance, her scrubs perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back in regulation tightness. Inside her jacket lining, sewn with military precision into the seam where nobody would ever look, was a faded unit patch from the 82nd Combat Support Hospital. The red lettering had faded almost to pink. Sometimes during her lunch break, she pressed her hand against her ribs where the patch sat against her skin, just to remember who she actually was. Not a nurse. Not even close. But the patch had to stay hidden. One accidental discovery and 6 months of intelligence work evaporated. One photograph uploaded to the wrong server and Colonel James Brennan's child stayed in a hospital bed with treatable symptoms nobody bothered to treat. The ICU doors slid open at 6:01 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar 60 Hz song. The monitors beeped in their staggered rhythm, 1 unit in sinus rhythm, 2 units with atrial fibrillation, 1 unit climbing into tachycardia. Katie had memorized every monitor's cadence over her first 2 weeks. She could tell by sound alone which patient was decompensating before the alarms fired. That kind of auditory awareness didn't come from nursing school. It came from 18 months of managing a field hospital where the difference between catastrophic failure and survival was sometimes just recognizing the sound of a pressure drop before the body followed. "Morning, Katie," said Marcus, the night shift charge nurse, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. He was folding a blanket that came back from laundry in the wrong shade. 3 new admits overnight. Bed 4 is a post-op from yesterday's appendectomy, stable. Bed 6 is failure to thrive admission from the county, stable. And bed 7. He paused, folding the blanket again with mechanical precision. Colonel Brennan's kid. Respiratory distress. Been here since midnight. Katie's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. That was the only tell. No one noticed. Dr. Pierce saw him. Yeah, assessed around 3 a.m. Said it was anxiety-related respiratory distress. Kid stressed about the hospitalization. He ordered Ativan and breathing treatments. Marcus handed her the report. But Katie. He lowered his voice. The kid's O2 saturation has been dropping every 2 hours. Started at 94. Now it's at 91. And there's something weird with his neck. Katie walked directly to bed 7 without responding. She had learned that silence was more powerful than agreement. Silence couldn't be used against her later. Silence was professional. Silence was invisible. Michael Brennan was 7 years old, with dark hair matted against his forehead with perspiration. His father, Colonel James Brennan, 5th Marine Regiment, was sleeping in the chair beside his bed, his massive frame folded awkwardly, his uniform jacket draped over his shoulders like a cape. The colonel had been the one who pulled Katie's own son out of a burning Humvee in Kandahar province 4 years ago. That was classified information she would take to her grave. That was also why she'd volunteered for this assignment the moment Air Force Intelligence mentioned St. Michael's as a potential posting. The boy's chest heaved. Each breath came harder than the last. Katie pulled the chart from the foot of the bed. Vitals, 91% O2 saturation on room air. Respiratory rate elevated at 32. Subcutaneous emphysema noted at 2:17 a.m. and documented by the night nurse, then apparently dismissed. She reached out and gently palpated the boy's neck, feeling for the characteristic crepitus, that Rice Krispies sensation that told her everything. There. Just above his clavicle. Subcutaneous emphysema meant air was leaking into the tissues. That didn't happen because of anxiety. That happened when something was wrong with the lungs themselves. "Good morning, Michael." Her voice dropped to the gentle frequency she used exclusively with pediatric patients. "I'm Katie. I'm going to check your breathing, okay? Can you take a deep breath for me?" The boy nodded. His shoulders rose and fell. The breath came in ragged gasps. In the right lung, the breath sounds were nearly absent. In the left, diminished. Katie's mind was running through the differential, tension pneumothorax, hemothorax, pleural effusion, or something worse. Something that required imaging. Something that Dr. Pierce had explicitly decided not to order. She released his shirt and stepped away from the bed. Colonel Brennan's eyes opened instantly, the kind of light sleep soldiers took during deployments, one ear always listening for danger. "Morning, Colonel." She kept her voice level. His stats dropped overnight. O2 sat is 91, respiratory rate is high. "Did you tell Pierce?" The colonel's voice was rough concrete. "I will during rounds." Katie checked before port, secure, no infiltration. "Has Michael complained of chest pain? Shoulder pain?" "No. Just breathing hard. Says his neck feels weird." Katie nodded. She documented the subcutaneous emphysema in the chart, adding precise measurements and times. She uploaded the information to her secure military email account using the hospital's Wi-Fi, coded in her standard intelligence format. Another notation in the growing file on Dr. Marcus Pierce: refusal to order advanced imaging despite clinical indicators suggesting pneumothorax or mediastinal involvement. 6 weeks. She'd been collecting these moments for 6 weeks. Misdiagnoses. Delayed treatments. Opioid orders that didn't match patient loads. Conversation she'd overheard between Pierce and a pharmaceutical rep near the supply room about bulk purchasing agreements and consulting fees. The DEA suspected diversion. Katie suspected something darker, a doctor who was economizing care based on which patients could pay, which insurance plans covered advanced diagnostics, which families had resources to pursue alternative treatment. Michael Brennan had one advantage: his father was a colonel. But even that wasn't protecting him from Dr. Pierce's clinical negligence. The morning wore on. Katie triple-checked the monitor settings on bed 7 at 7:15 a.m., at 8:40 a.m., and at 9:52 a.m. Each time, Michael's O2 saturation had dropped another point. 90, 89, 88, his respiratory rate climbed. The monitor's beeping accelerated incrementally, and most people wouldn't notice the change. Katie noticed. She'd been trained to notice when bodies were failing. At 10:44 a.m., the intercom crackled, "All residents report to conference room for 10:15 rounds." Katie felt the weight of it immediately, the sinking gravity that meant she would have to watch Dr. Pierce examine Michael again, listen to him explain away the deteriorating vitals as psychosomatic, and do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Any action, any contradiction, any suggestion of his incompetence could jeopardize her investigation. That was the protocol. That was the mission. She watched from the nursing station as the residents filed past, their white coats crisp, their clipboards ready, their faces arranged in expressions of appropriate medical deference. Dr. Pierce emerged from his office at 10:13 a.m. He was tall, silver-haired, the type of doctor whose confidence was so complete that nurses had learned to stop questioning his judgment entirely. He moved through the pediatric ICU like a man who owned the building. "Rodriguez," he called as he passed. She looked up. "Did you document the at-even administration time on the Brennan boys chart?" "Yes, sir." 3:17 a.m. "And the breathing treatments?" "For 38 a.m. and 8:45 a.m. Both times his saturation improved briefly. Pierce nodded, satisfied that the system was working exactly as he'd prescribed. "He's anxious. Probably a first hospitalization. Treating the anxiety treats the respiratory distress." He said this loudly enough that the residents heard him. Loudly enough that it became gospel. Loudly enough that nobody would question it. We don't need to throw every imaging modality at a child having a panic attack. That's irresponsible medicine. Katie didn't respond. She returned her attention to the monitor screens, watching the tracing scroll across the displays like prophecies written in digital light. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to happen. Dr. Pierce approached bed 7 at 10:22 a.m., flanked by 3 residents who looked terrified in that specific way medical residents were always terrified, afraid of asking the wrong question, afraid of revealing ignorance, afraid of contradicting a senior attending. He placed his stethoscope in his ears and listened to Michael's chest for exactly 12 seconds on the right side, 8 seconds on the left. Heart sounds clear. Lungs show some diminished breath sounds, but that's consistent with muscular tension from anxiety. He removed the stethoscope. Pulse ox is 88%, which is still acceptable for a pediatric patient at rest. Once we get the child more relaxed, we'll see this resolve. No acute intervention needed. The resident scribbled notes. One of them started to speak, a young woman with dark eyes and the terrified expression of someone about to ask a question she knew she shouldn't, but Pierce continued talking. The real issue in pediatric medicine is over-medicalization. Families come in expecting every symptom to require imaging and intervention. Our job is to educate the family about the limits of technology and the power of reassurance. He was teaching them, training them, inoculating them against ever questioning his judgment. A chest CT on this child would be expensive, expose him to unnecessary radiation, and provide the family with false reassurance. That's not medicine. That's luxury healthcare. Katie felt Colonel Brennan's eyes on her from across the ICU. She didn't look at him. Looking at him would confirm that she had heard the same things he had heard, seen the same dismissal, reached the same conclusion, that his son was being denied care not because the care wasn't indicated, but because Dr. Pierce had decided it wasn't worth the cost. The rounds concluded at 10:08 a.m. Dr. Pierce left the ICU. The residents dispersed. And Katie sat at the nursing station, updating vitals every 5 minutes, watching Michael Brennan's oxygen saturation continue its inexorable descent. She opened her encrypted email. In the subject line, she typed a single word, urgent. In the message body, she documented every clinical indicator, every refusal to order imaging, every time Dr. Pierce's pattern had deviated from standard pediatric care. She attached photos of the chart, screenshots of the monitor tracings, and the suspicious pharmaceutical receipt she'd found during her routine cleaning of the supply room. She didn't hit send. Not yet. The timing had to be perfect. Michael Brennan's oxygen saturation dropped to 87%. His breathing grew harder. And somewhere in the hospital, a doctor who believed his authority was absolute continued conducting his rounds, completely unaware that the quiet nurse in the pediatric ICU was watching, documenting, and building a case that would change everything. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It was going to bring the hospital to its knees. Grand rounds began at 2:15 p.m. in the pediatric ICU, and Katie Rodriguez knew exactly what was coming before Dr. Pierce opened his mouth. 12 residents lined up like soldiers awaiting orders, their clipboards held at chest level, eyes eager to learn which mistake they could weaponize. 4 attending physicians stood at the back of the room, careful not to make eye contact with each other. The hospital administrator, a woman named Hartwell with a permanent frown, positioned herself near the door where she could document everything. Dr. Pierce stood at the head of Michael Brennan's bed like a general surveying conquered territory. His voice carried across the ICU with the precision of someone accustomed to obedience. "Let's discuss a case study in what happens when nurses overreach their competence." He gestured toward Katie with 2 fingers, as though she were an exhibit in a museum of professional failures. "Nurse Rodriguez here has demanded, a chest CT for this patient. Can someone explain why that's inappropriate?" A resident, lanky and eager to please, spoke up immediately. "The patient presents with anxiety-related hyperventilation, consistent with his documented behavioral issues." The words came out rehearsed, delivered with the confidence of someone repeating what they'd been told to believe. Pierce nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. But Nurse Rodriguez apparently believes her nursing degree qualifies her to override my medical judgment." He let the pause stretch, a calculated silence designed to invite ridicule. "This is the 3rd imaging request she's made this week that I've had to deny. Perhaps she's confused about the hierarchy here. Or perhaps," he paused again, turning to face his audience fully, "she's simply not competent enough to distinguish between clinical intuition and paranoia." The residents smirked behind their clipboards. One of them, a woman with red hair and sharp teeth, actually smiled. Hartwell's pen moved across her notepad in quick, efficient scratches. Katie stood against the far wall, her back pressed against the cool tile, her face as blank as hospital drywall. Her jaw tightened. A single muscle. No more than a millimeter of movement. No one watching would have seen it, but it was there. Pierce continued, emboldened by the silence. "I want to be clear about something for all of you. Medicine is not a democracy. Medicine is not a committee. Medicine is a hierarchy built on years of training, board certification, and the weight of professional responsibility. A nurse, no matter how well-intentioned, does not have the authority to question a physician's diagnostic judgment. Is that understood?" The residents nodded in unison, a synchronized gesture that made the room feel smaller and colder. At 3 o'clock, Katie stood at the vending machine in the staff lounge, feeding quarters into the metal slot with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps trapped in plastic cages. The machine hummed, considering her request, then dispensed a cup of black coffee that steamed with the kind of bitter intensity that matched her mood. Her hands were steady. Calm. The hands of someone who had held a field hospital together while artillery shredded the air around her. Dr. Pierce entered the lounge without knocking. He never knocked. The room belonged to him, apparently, the way everything else seemed to. He watched her retrieve her coffee, then smiled, a smile that looked like a wolf showing its teeth before it lunges. "Coffee, Rodriguez? Can you even afford it on your paycheck?" He laughed, a sound like gravel being dragged across concrete. "Oh wait, that paycheck might be under review given your performance issues." He stepped closer, invading the space between them with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never been taught that personal boundaries applied to him. "I've been watching you watching me. Whatever you think you're doing, it stops now." His voice dropped, becoming almost intimate, the intimacy of a threat whispered too close to someone's ear. "You continue interfering with my treatment protocols, and I'll have security escort you out of this hospital in handcuffs. Do we understand each other?" He leaned against the vending machine, completely blocking her exit. His posture said he could stand there forever. His expression said he was enjoying this. Katie moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that made her actions feel heavy, weighted with intention. She fed quarters into the machine one by one. Turned the knob. Retrieved her coffee. The steam rose between them like a barrier neither of them could quite see through. She turned to face him directly, and when she did, her eyes locked onto his with the kind of stare that made experienced interrogators uncomfortable. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. In that silence, Katie could hear the ventilator in Michael's room humming its mechanical rhythm. She could hear the distant beep of a heart monitor 3 rooms down. She could hear her own pulse, steady, measured, the pulse of someone who had calmed her breathing through mortar fire. "My son's commanding officer is in pediatric ICU right now because 3 doctors were too afraid of you to order the imaging I requested. Each word came out separate and distinct, like individual rounds fired at intervals that gave them maximum impact. Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it dropped lower, deeper, the kind of voice that made people strain to hear it. 7-year-old Michael Brennan is struggling to breathe because you decided anxiety was more likely than the pneumothorax that's probably crushing his heart right now. Pierce's face shifted colors, pink to red to a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was ascending at a dangerous rate. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand reached for her arm, a gesture that contained all the arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Katie turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of someone leaving a conversation rather than fleeing from one. The sound of her shoes on the tile floor was the only sound either of them made. Behind her, Dr. Pierce stood frozen at the vending machine, his hand still reaching for empty air, his mouth still forming words that would never be spoken. The next voice either of them would hear would be a monitor alarm. But that wasn't the worst part. At 11:06 p.m., Katie sat at her kitchen table reviewing encrypted surveillance files on her laptop when her phone buzzed. The screen showed St. Michael's main line. The night charge nurse, a woman named Rivera who actually cared about her patients, had a voice tight with controlled panic. Michael Brennan's saturation is dropping. 84%. Pierce left orders for more albuterol, but he's not responding to pages. The words came out clipped, professional, but underneath them was the sound of someone watching a child die in slow motion and not being able to stop it. Katie was already moving. Her keys were in her hand before the call ended. The faded unit patch, the one sewn into the lining of her jacket in a place no one would ever see, seemed to pulse against her ribs as she grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. 12 minutes in the car. 85 miles per hour through residential streets at midnight. She made it in 9. The pediatric ICU at St. Michael's had a particular smell, a combination of antiseptic, ozone from the defibrillator pads, and something else that Katie could never quite identify. Desperation, maybe. The smell of people fighting against biology. Michael Brennan's room was at the end of the corridor. Through the window, she could see his small chest heaving asymmetrically, his lips a shade of blue that should never appear on a child's face. His trachea had deviated sharply to the left, just as she predicted. Attention pneumothorax. Air filling the space between his right lung and his chest wall, pressure building with every breath he took, crushing his heart millimeter by millimeter. Rivera met her at the door, her eyes wide with something between relief and fear. "Where's the on-call doctor?" Katie's voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders in situations where hesitation cost lives. Dr. Pierce said he'd handle any Michael Brennan calls personally. He's not answering his phone. He's not answering his pager. Rivera's words tumbled out like rocks down a mountainside. "I've been trying for 12 minutes. Michael's saturation keeps dropping." Katie was already moving toward the supply cart. "I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol prep, and a good light source. Now." Her hands moved through the motions of preparation, glove, sterile field, equipment check, with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory built in a 82nd Combat Support Hospital in Helmand Province, where a 7-year-old girl with shrapnel in her abdomen had needed the same intervention Katie was about to perform. "You're not authorized to," Rivera started to say, but the look Katie gave her cut the sentence in half. "I know." Katie positioned Michael, found the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. The child's skin was cool and clammy, his breathing rapid and shallow. No time to explain. No time to follow protocol. No time for anything except the one thing that would keep him alive. Hold him steady. Don't let him move. The needle slid through skin and subcutaneous tissue and the pleural membrane in one smooth motion. The trapped air hissed out like a tire deflating, that particular sound that meant life instead of death, oxygen instead of compression. The needle withdrew. Pressure applied. Michael's lips flushed pink within 15 seconds. His oxygen saturation climbed like a prayer being answered, 88%, 92%, 95%, 98%. The monitor alarm that had been screaming silenced itself with a sigh of electronic relief. Rivera stared at Katie with an expression that contained equal parts gratitude and horror. "Where did you learn that?" Katie didn't answer. Instead, she applied a sterile dressing to the site and stepped back, allowing the room to breathe again. The ventilator hummed. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Outside the window, Raleigh's night sky was the color of wet concrete. At 12:08 a.m., footsteps approached Michael's room with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested someone who had received a call and understood its implications. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculation in the space of 2 seconds. His eyes moved across the room, Michael's pink lips, the normalized saturation reading on the monitor, the sterile dressing on the boy's chest, and came to rest on Katie, who stood with her back against the wall in the exact same position she'd occupied during grand rounds. "Who performed a procedure on my patient?" His voice was different now. Not angry. Worse than angry. Strategic. The voice of someone who understood that he'd just been challenged and was already calculating how to transform that challenge into an advantage. His hand moved toward the emergency call button, but he didn't press it. Not yet. First, he needed to understand who he was actually dealing with. Katie met his eyes with that same cold, flat stare. And somewhere in the fluorescent-lit hallway of St. Michael's Hospital, in a city that had no idea what was actually happening in its walls, a cascade of consequences was already beginning to unfold. 11:47 p.m. Katie's phone lit up on her kitchen table while she scrolled through encrypted surveillance files on her secure laptop, the pharmaceutical distributor invoices, the prescription patterns, the pieces that didn't fit. Michael's monitor spike hit her handler's relay system first. Then the hospital's general alert. Code blue. Pediatric ICU. Her hand moved before her brain caught up. Jacket. Keys. The 40-minute drive from her apartment back to St. Michael's would take her 23 minutes at the speed she was willing to drive on empty Raleigh streets, and she'd break exactly 0 traffic laws getting there because that's what operational discipline meant. The night shift ICU looked different at midnight. Different staff, different lighting, the institutional hum of a hospital pretending to sleep while machines screamed in the dark. Katie moved like she belonged there, muscle memory of 1,000 night shifts in field hospitals where you walked like you owned the room because stopping to check credentials cost lives. Her badge wouldn't open the pediatric ICU doors. She'd surrendered it at security less than 6 hours ago. She knew Sarah Chen, the charge nurse, would still be on shift. Knew the keypad code hadn't changed in the 3 weeks she'd worked here. Knew the security footage had a 43-second blind spot between the corner camera's sweep and the hallway monitor's reset cycle. She was inside when the alarms were still screaming. Michael Brennan lay in the bed like a small broken bird, his chest heaving against muscles that had forgotten how to breathe. His lips had gone blue around the edges, cyanotic, the technical term, but what it actually meant was his oxygen saturation had dropped below 60. The monitor showed it, 58. 54, 51. His ribs were pulling inward so hard Katie could see the indentation below his sternum on each desperate breath. Retractions. Subcostal retractions. The body's final warning that the lungs weren't getting air. The skin above his collarbone pulled inward with each gasp. Supraclavicular retractions. The kid was drowning in open air. Dr. Pierce stood at the bedside with the expression of a man watching something he'd predicted come to pass. Vindication. No alarm in his face. No urgency. His hands were in his pockets. 3 nurses were moving around Michael with the mechanical precision of people who'd been trained not to question protocol, and every single one of them was too young to have combat experience, too new to know that sometimes following orders meant watching someone die. Katie's eyes moved across Michael's chest to his neck. The deviation was subtle but unmistakable if you knew where to look. The trachea, or the windpipe, had shifted maybe 2 centimeters to the right. The left side of his chest was hyperresonant, meaning it was filled with air that had nowhere to go. Tension pneumothorax. Not a guess. Not a theory. The clinical presentation was textbook, and the textbook diagnosis was that the boy's left lung had ruptured and was filling his chest cavity with air pressure that was collapsing his heart against his right lung. Michael had maybe 4 minutes before his heart rate would bottom out entirely. After that, the code would be academic. Step back. Katie's voice came out flat, neutral, the way she'd learned to give orders in environments where inflection could be mistaken for doubt. She was moving before anyone could answer, moving to the medication cart, her hands finding the equipment she needed like hands that had done this 1,000 times before. Because they had. The Razi Hospital in Helmand Province. The forward operating base at Shank. The 82nd Combat Support Hospital during the spring offensive in 2019 when the casualties came in faster than the surgeons could move between beds. I said step back. Not a request this time. The voice had gone colder, lower, the voice of someone who'd given that command in languages 3 of the nurses present didn't speak. Katie, what are you? Sarah's voice, confused, concerned. Katie already had the 14-gauge angiocath needle. The alcohol wipe was already prepping the skin. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Anatomy was the same whether you were in a tent outside Kandahar or in a hospital with climate control and real walls. She could feel where the second rib was beneath Michael's pale skin. Could feel the intercostal space below it. Her fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon who'd done this in darkness, in chaos, in conditions that made the sterile environment of St. Michael's look like a luxury. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the pleural space was the sound of pressure releasing, of equilibrium returning to chaos. It was the sound Katie had learned to recognize as the difference between a kid who'd breathe and a kid who wouldn't. The needle was through, the catheter was in place, and the one-way valve she'd rigged from sterile saline and fur tubing was already letting the air out while preventing it from coming back in. Michael gasped. Not the panicked, drowning gasp of a child whose lungs were collapsing. The desperate, full breath of someone who could suddenly breathe again. His oxygen saturation jumped. 54. 62. 70. 78. 84. His chest expanded in a way it hadn't expanded in hours. The ribs that had been pulling inward so desperately began to relax. His color shifted from the blue-gray of profound hypoxia to something approximating human. The monitor's steady beep returned to a rhythm that matched something like a living child. Get me a chest tube tray. Katie's hands were already reaching for the equipment she'd need next, the proper procedure, the thing that would be in the textbooks and the hospital protocols. Oxygen mask. 6 liters. She didn't turn around. Didn't check whether anyone was moving. The tone of voice that got people moving wasn't a question mark at the end of a sentence. It was a period. A full stop. An absolute statement of what was about to happen next, whether the universe cooperated or not. Sarah was moving. 2 of the younger nurses were moving. The third one, a girl named Jessica who'd gone pale, was staring at Katie with the expression of someone watching a nurse become something else entirely. Michael, hey, buddy, I know you're scared. Katie was changing her voice now, the way you changed your voice when you were talking to a child whose lung had collapsed, whose brain was probably still fuzzy from hypoxia, whose body had just fought a battle and won by margins so thin they barely existed. You're going to feel better really fast. You're going to breathe. You're going to be okay. I need you to stay really still for me. Can you do that? The kid's eyes were on hers. Terrified. But tracking. Conscious. Aware. Those things mattered more than anything else in the next 60 seconds. Dr. Pierce hadn't moved. He was still standing with his hands in his pockets, watching Katie work over Michael like he was watching a chess match where he'd already calculated 14 moves ahead. His expression hadn't changed. If anything, it had gotten darker, colder, the look of someone who'd realized that a problem he thought he'd contained had just detonated in his hands. The chest tube took for minutes. The tube was 24 French, inserted at the 5th intercostal space in the mid-axillary line, standard protocol for a pediatric pneumothorax, textbook procedure for someone who'd done emergency procedures in combat zones where there was no textbook, only the choice between doing it right and watching kids die. Michael's oxygen climbed to 91%. His heart rate settled from 180 down to 110. His respiratory rate dropped from 50 breaths per minute to something resembling normal for a 7-year-old. The kid was breathing. Sarah Chen was staring at her with the kind of expression people got when they realized they'd just watched someone do something that wasn't supposed to be possible. The charge nurse of a pediatric ICU with 20 years of experience had just watched a nurse, a suspended, controversial, publicly humiliated nurse, save a child's life using a procedure that required 3 separate violations of hospital protocol, 2 violations of her job description, and 1 casual disregard for the limitations that Dr. Pierce had spent the last week establishing around her. "Call respiratory," Katie said to Sarah. "Get Michael on a ventilator if he decompensates. If the tube clogs, we'll need to replace it." She stepped back from the bed, and for the first time she looked at Dr. Pierce. Looked him directly in the eye. His saturation stable. His pressures normalizing. He's going to live. Pierce's jaw had tightened. The hands came out of his pockets. He pulled his phone from his coat with the deliberate motion of someone about to make very specific, very calculated decisions. "Everyone out except the charge nurse," he said. His voice was ice water. "Now." The nurses moved. The younger ones fled the room like they'd been released from a spell. Katie didn't move. "That means you, Rodriguez." "Michael had a tension pneumothorax," Katie said. Her voice hadn't changed at all. "I performed needle decompression. He's stable." She kept looking at him. Not challenging. Not backing down. Just standing there like someone who'd already survived things that would have killed the look on his face. Pierce moved to the bedside. He didn't look at Michael. He looked at Sarah. "You witnessed this?" he asked. Sarah's throat moved. Her eyes went to Katie, then back to Pierce. 20 years in nursing meant knowing what a question like that was. It meant knowing what answering certain ways would cost. The charge nurse took a breath like someone about to jump off a cliff. "Yes," she said. "I witnessed it." Pierce pulled out his phone. The first call was to hospital administration. Katie heard his voice shift, not louder, but more official, the tone of someone reporting a safety incident with the gravitas it deserved. "I'm reporting an unauthorized invasive procedure performed by a nurse without physician authorization. Patient was given a needle decompression that was not ordered." "Yes. I'm aware of patient outcome. That's not the legal issue here." The words came out measured, precise, the words of someone building a case the way lawyers built cases, brick by brick, with each statement supporting the next one. The second call was to the state nursing board. "I need to report concerns about a licensed nurse operating outside scope of practice." "Yes, at St. Michael's. The name is Katie Rodriguez. I'm questioning whether her credentials are, let me put it this way. I'm questioning whether her training adequately prepared her to perform invasive procedures. No, I don't have independent verification of her background." He hung up. The third call was to hospital security. "I need documentation of an incident in the pediatric ICU at 11:53 p.m. Nurse named Rodriguez. Unauthorized medical procedure." "Yes, I want incident photos." He pocketed his phone and looked at Katie like she was something that had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way. "You're to have no further patient contact pending investigation." He walked out. The room was quiet except for the hiss of the ventilator and the steady beep of Michael's heart rate climbing back toward normal. Sarah stood by the bed with tears running down her face, not crying out loud, just letting them fall like something she couldn't control any more than she could control gravity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Katie put a hand on her shoulder. "You told the truth. That's what matters." But both of them understood what the truth was going to cost. The administrative office called at 6 a.m. The suspension notice was already prepared, sitting on the desk like something that had been waiting for Katie to sign. "Pending investigation by the state board and internal review." Effective immediately. The words on the paper might as well have been a blade, and both of them knew it. Katie's badge clattered against the security desk at 6:47 a.m., the sound of something official and final hitting stainless steel. She passed the pediatric ICU on her way out. Through the window she could see Michael Brennan sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, a chest that had nearly stopped forever and hadn't, a kid who'd breathe another 60, 70, 80 years because a nurse had been willing to break every rule that mattered less than breathing. She didn't let herself look at him twice. By morning, Dr. Pierce had already moved. The incident report was filed at 6:33 a.m., before the sun cleared the hospital's east wing, before the day shift arrived with their coffee and their routines. An authorized invasive procedure performed without physician oversight or consent. The words were precise. Clinical. The kind of language that made suspensions feel inevitable. Katie read them in the break room, standing alone, the printed pages trembling in her steadier-than-usual hands. Not from fear. From restraint. The kind of trembling that came from knowing exactly what you could say and choosing not to say it. By 7:15 a.m., Dr. Pierce's second call had already reached the state nursing board in Raleigh. Katie learned this detail the way she learned most things now, by not being told. By overhearing two administrators in the hallway outside the pediatric unit, their voices pitched low, their concern genuine. He said her credentials might be fraudulent. Mental health concerns. Potentially dangerous to patients. The words landed like stones in still water, each one creating rings that spread outward, connecting to other investigations, other questions, other doubts. She didn't flinch when Dr. Pierce walked past her station at 8:33 a.m. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't meet his eyes. She continued documenting Michael Brennan's vitals, the ones that showed a child alive because someone had been willing to break protocol and let the silence say what her voice couldn't. By 9:20 a.m., the ICU charge nurse who had witnessed everything, who had handed Katie the 14-gauge catheter and watched her hands move with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times in the dark and the dust and the screaming, was being reassigned to the pediatric floor. A simple administrative shuffle. A rotation that made perfect sense on paper. Katie watched Margaret collect her personal items from her locker, watched her jaw tighten, watched her refuse to make eye contact, not out of fear, but out of loyalty to someone she suddenly couldn't talk to anymore. "I'm sorry," Katie said quietly, the only word she'd spoken directly to another human since Michael had stabilized. "I know," Margaret replied, and that was all there was room for. By 11:04 a.m., Dr. Pierce had personally informed St. Michael's Hospital administration that Nurse Katie Rodriguez may be mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to patients. He used the word may like a scalpel, precise enough that it couldn't be called a direct accusation, damning enough that it didn't need to be. He suggested immediate suspension pending a psychological evaluation. He suggested that her recent behavior, a nurse saving a dying child, indicated a pattern of impulsive decision-making that could endanger others. The hospital administrator called Katie into her office at 12:08 p.m. Not to accuse. Not to investigate. To present a fait accompli dressed in the language of policy and procedure. Katie sat across from her, a woman named Diana Chen who had hired her 4 months ago and had no idea she was hiring a decorated Air Force intelligence officer with a combat field hospital patch still sewn into her jacket lining like a prayer. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending review," Diana said, her voice careful, her eyes apologetic. "I'm sure this is temporary. But we have to take these concerns seriously." Katie could have said something. Could have told Diana about the 3 other imaging orders Dr. Pierce had delayed. About the pattern in his prescription refills that matched the opioid diversion markers that Air Force intelligence had been tracking for 6 months. About the pharmaceutical rep that Pierce met with every Tuesday in the parking garage. About the fact that Michael Brennan was alive because Katie had been willing to commit a crime that saved a child's life. Instead, she nodded. Accepted the suspension. Accepted the protection that silence offered, the only kind of protection that wouldn't compromise an investigation worth millions, and 6 months of her life embedded in a hospital watching a man systematically harm patients because their insurance coverage made them less profitable to treat. "I understand," Katie said quietly. She surrendered her hospital badge at the security desk at 2:34 p.m. The badge that identified her as Katie Rodriguez, pediatric nurse, St. Michael's Hospital. The badge that had been her only identity in this place, the only thing that explained why she moved through these corridors asking careful questions and taking notes in her notebook that looked like medical documentation but read like intelligence reports. The security guard, Marcus, who sometimes brought her coffee during night shifts, looked at her badge in his hand like it was a piece of someone's heart. "This temporary?" he asked. "Everything's temporary," Katie said. She drove home on autopilot, the kind of driving that happens when your hands know the way and your mind is somewhere else entirely. The Hindu Kush. A field hospital made from sandbags and duct tape, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. Forward operating base Salerno. 23 soldiers. 6 hours. No backup. No extraction. No choice. Her apartment was quiet when she arrived, the afternoon light slanting through the kitchen window in thick golden bars. The kind of light that existed in a different world than the one where children coded and doctors lied and nurses took orders that felt like participation in a slow murder. She sat at the kitchen table. Didn't change out of her scrubs. Didn't make coffee. Didn't call her handler or her commanding officer or anyone who might have advice about what to do when the cost of saving one child was losing everything else. She just sat there with her hands folded in front of her, watching the light move across the table, watching time pass in the kind of quiet that only came when you'd stopped fighting. At 2:38 p.m. on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it could have been any other day, the front door opened. Danny. 10 years old. Blonde hair that needed cutting. Backpack slung over one shoulder like he'd forgotten how to put it down properly. He stopped when he saw her, his entire body stilling in that way children's bodies still when they sense something wrong with the adult world they depend on. "Mom? Why are you home?" She wiped her eyes quickly, but not quickly enough. Danny had inherited her ability to read a room in half a second. To know when something had shifted and the ground beneath you wasn't solid anymore. "I had to leave work early, buddy." He set his backpack down slowly, moving like he was walking through water. "Are you sick?" The question landed soft and careful, the way he'd learned to ask about her after his father died, after she'd come home from Walter Reed with scars and missing time and a way of looking at things that never quite returned to the world they'd inhabited before. "No. Just..." She stopped. Couldn't finish. Couldn't say, "I saved someone's child and they're trying to destroy me for it." Couldn't say, "The man I saved him from is powerful and careful and he's going to win." Couldn't say, "I have no idea how we're going to pay rent if they fire me and I can't explain why I can't just get another job because I'm suspended, pending a psychiatric evaluation, under investigation by a man who's committing fraud." "I'm taking a break," she said instead. Danny came closer. He smelled like school, pencil shavings and the lunch he hadn't finished and the specific loneliness of a child who'd learned to be independent too early. He reached out and touched her arm, the way she'd touched Michael Brennan's chest when she was checking for breath sounds that might not come back. "Is it about Dad?" he asked. The question cracked something in her chest. She pulled him close, held him against her, breathed in the realness of him, alive and here and hers and nothing to do with Colonel Brennan or his son or the choices that had gotten made in the dark at midnight when a child was dying. "No, sweetheart. Not about Dad. Just work stuff." He didn't ask what kind of work stuff. He'd learned not to ask those questions. Instead, he went to put his backpack away and asked if they could order pizza, and Katie said yes, and they sat together watching the light change and the day move toward evening, and she didn't tell him that everything had changed, because children understood that already. They always did. That night, after Danny had fallen asleep on the couch, Katie sat with her phone in the darkness and read through 17 missed calls from Angela Brennan, Michael's mother. The messages grew increasingly frantic. "Katie, where are you? Michael keeps asking for the nurse. He won't eat. Then, why aren't you answering? Is something wrong? Then, I heard there was an incident. That you were in trouble. Please call me. We need to help you. The last one, sent at 11:03 p.m. at Michael loves you. Whatever happened, whatever they're saying, we believe you. Katie turned the phone face down on the table. At 9:16 p.m., her handler called on the secure line. His name was Morrison. She'd never seen his face. Had only heard his voice through encrypted channels, always professional, always one step ahead of whatever crisis was unfolding. We need to talk about your status, he said. Katie moved to the back bedroom, closed the door quietly so Danny wouldn't wake. I'm suspended. Pending psychiatric evaluation for an authorized invasive procedure. We know. Pierce moved fast. He's scared. Yes. Morrison paused. Long enough that Katie could hear the traffic on whatever street he was standing on, could imagine him in some nondescript car somewhere in America, running an operation she was now exploding from the inside of. Captain, I need to know if you can hold. We have 2 more weeks of documentation on the diversion ring. 2 more weeks and we have him locked down for federal charges. Katie thought of Michael Brennan's blue lips. Thought of Margaret being reassigned. Thought of the 17 messages from a mother who'd lost her child for 6 hours and thought she'd lost him forever. Thought of Danny asleep on the couch with his backpack beside him, getting ready for a world where his mother was unemployable and suspended and broken. I don't have 2 weeks, Katie said. I'm suspended. Then we pull you out. Restart the investigation from zero. 6 months of work becomes a classified file. Katie looked at the reflection of her face in the dark window of her bedroom. A woman she barely recognized anymore. A woman who'd held lives together with her bare hand in places where the laws of the world didn't apply. A woman who was learning, slowly, that the laws of the world applied everywhere. There's another pattern, she said quietly. Pierce isn't just moving opioids. Go. He's delaying treatment on patients with military-dependent insurance. Marginal cases. Kids like Michael Brennan. He delays imaging, delays diagnosis, delays treatment, and the insurance companies deny coverage for pre-existing conditions or insufficient medical necessity. I think Pierce is getting kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives for keeping their opioid prescriptions high while keeping legitimate medical claims low. The line went silent. Katie could hear Morrison breathing, calculating, measuring the weight of what she'd just said against the weight of what it would cost to prove it. Can you document it? He finally asked. I need access to his billing records. His prescription logs. His meeting schedule. And I need them fast. You're suspended, Captain. I know. If you're caught accessing hospital records while under suspension and pending evaluation, it's not corporate discipline anymore. It's criminal. It's the end of your career regardless of how this investigation concludes. Katie thought of Michael Brennan's oxygen saturation climbing, 75. 82, 88. Stable. She thought of what happened if no one was willing to pay that price. What happened to the children that came after? What happened to the children that came after them? Then I'd better not get caught, she said. 3 days later, Katie walked through the ER waiting room wearing civilian clothes, her badge surrendered but her instincts still screaming. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her suspension letter had been explicit: no access to hospital grounds, no patient contact, no involvement in care. But the waiting room had 37 people, 3 of them pediatric, and only 1 nurse working triage. She stood near the water fountain and watched. An elderly woman with a tremor. A teenager with what looked like appendicitis, clutching her abdomen at the wrong angle. A mother with an infant showing the early signs of dehydration. Katie's hands moved on their own, straightening a child's blanket, pointing the mother toward the bathroom so she could fill a cup with water without alarming the infant. She wasn't practicing medicine. She wasn't even officially present. She was just watching. Just helping. just unable to stop being what she'd been trained to be. The ER doors slid open. A man in his 40s entered, lean and dark-eyed, with the careful walk of someone learning to live in a body that no longer worked the way it used to. Katie didn't recognize him at first. The charts and intake forms had his name, Ahmed Hassan, requesting asylum processing, referred by a non-profit legal clinic, but nothing about his face rang familiar. Then his eyes found her across the waiting room. And he went completely white. His lips moved silently. Then the word came out as a whisper so thin it nearly disappeared, Valkyrie. The room didn't stop. Nobody else heard him. But Katie heard the word like a sniper round hitting steel, and every muscle in her body went rigid. Valkyrie. The call sign coalition forces had given her in the Hindu Kush. The name shouted over radio static during the 6-hour siege when she'd held the 82nd Combat Support Hospital field station alone while rounds punched through the canvas walls. The name used only by people who'd been there. Only by people who'd watched her stop the bleeding and stabilize the spines and refuse evacuation until the last wounded soldier was loaded on a Black Hawk. Only by insurgents and Army and Air Force personnel who understood that some people didn't break under fire. They just worked. This man had been on the other side of those guns. Katie's throat tightened. She crossed the waiting room in 4 steps, her movements making the subtle shift from nurse to something else entirely. Come with me. Not a request. Not a question. Her hand found his elbow with the same grip she'd used to steady wounded soldiers through shock. She guided him toward the back corner, away from the intake desk, away from security cameras. His hands were shaking. Her hands were steady. You were Taliban medic, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen his file when she'd flagged it for her handler 3 hours ago. 3rd Battalion, Sanjin Valley Sector. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. You came through the village. 2009, you had no protection. Surgical supplies in a medical bag. You worked on civilians and soldiers without difference. I was there to stop you. I had orders. His voice broke. Then I understood. You were there to save people. I was there to kill them. That night, I stopped being Taliban. Behind them, the ER triage desk speaker crackled. A Marine colonel, mid-50s, bearing the distinctive posture of someone who'd spent 30 years making decisions that mattered, looked up from the intake form he'd been filing. He was a visiting consultant from Camp Lezan, here for a medical ethics symposium. His eyes had tracked the Pashto words and Katie's response. His eyes had registered the call sign. And his brain, trained to connect intelligence dots, had just drawn a line. He stood and moved toward them with the unhurried pace of a man who'd learned that authority didn't require speed. Captain Rodriguez. His voice carried absolute certainty. Like he'd already known the answer before he asked. Katie turned. The Marine colonel held out his phone, his hand rock steady. I just pulled your service record from the SIPR network. I have authorization. Wanted to verify something. He began to read aloud, his voice cutting through the waiting room's ambient hum of monitors and crying children and fluorescent lights buzzing with the electric hiss of power running through outdated wiring. Captain Catherine Rodriguez. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Reactions from the waiting room, a nurse glancing over. A security guard straightening. Purple Heart. Another pause. The room was quieting. Purple Heart, 2nd Medal. The reading room was silent now. All eyes turned. Meritorious service in Operation Enduring Freedom. He looked up from the phone. 2 consecutive tours with the 82nd Combat Support Hospital. 6 commendations. 1 classified surgical intervention that saved an entire convoy. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce shoved through the ER doors from the back corridor, his face the color of old concrete. He'd seen the crowd gathering. He'd heard the Marine colonel reading off medals like an ammunition count. His voice came out sharp and strangled. That's a fraudulent record. I called the state nursing board. They confirmed it. There is no Captain Catherine Rodriguez in any military database. She's a fabrication. This woman is unqualified and he stopped. His eyes found the Marine colonel, then Katie, then back to the colonel. The calculation happening in real time. The moment Pierce understood that something had shifted beyond his control. The hospital administrator, Dr. Sarah Chen, emerged from her office with the slow certainty of someone who'd spent the last 3 hours in conversation with federal agents. Behind her came 2 men in suits that fit like they had guns underneath. Air Force Office of Special Investigations. She was holding a folder the size of a small child. Dr. Pierce, I need you to come with me to my office. Her voice was pleasant and implacable, the tone used to deliver terminal diagnoses. And I need you to step away from that computer. Security had already moved. A young officer, barely 30, positioned himself between Pierce and his workstation with the casual precision of someone trained for exactly this scenario. Pierce's face went through a series of expressions like a broken television cycling through channels. Confusion. Anger. Fear. The moment when a man realizes the infrastructure he built to protect himself was actually a ladder someone else was climbing. Chen's voice remained steady as she opened the folder. Our investigation into your treatment protocols led us to examine your billing records. We found quarterly payments from Pharma Health Solutions totaling $218,000 over the past 4 years. In exchange for what appears to be deliberate treatment delays on military-dependent patients. Patients whose insurance coverage you deemed insufficient to justify advanced imaging. She turned a page. Michael Brennan's CT scan was ordered at 9:53 p.m. Delayed by radiology for 6 hours due to your documented notation, patient's insurance classification does not justify expense of advanced imaging at this time. Another page. That delay nearly cost a 7-year-old boy his life. The company saved approximately $3,400 by denying that imaging. Michael's parents will be receiving a check for their pain and suffering. So will 17 other families. Pierce's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His power, his institutional authority, his carefully constructed walls, all of it had been built on a foundation of kickbacks and insurance fraud. The strategic competence Katie had feared, the reason 3 doctors had hesitated to order Michael's imaging, had actually been corruption wearing a white coat. The Air Force investigators stepped forward. Dr. Franklin Pierce, you're under investigation by the Department of Defense Inspector General for violation of the Anti-Kickback Statute, Medicare fraud, and endangering military dependents. You have the right to, but Pierce wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had found Katie one more time, and in that moment, she saw the exact second he understood, the suspension, the incident report, the state board call, all of it had been his attempt to silence a witness who was actually gathering evidence. He'd built his own case for prosecution. He'd handed the prosecution his own confession. Security escorted him toward the office. His hands were shaking now. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the cardiac monitors beeping in the distant trauma bay, each pulse like a countdown to a conviction. The Marine colonel extended his hand to Katie. Captain Rodriguez, I'm Colonel Mitchell, Medical Corps. I saw what you did here. What you've been doing. The investigation into military-dependent insurance fraud across the southeastern region, your documentation initiated a full federal review. He paused. His grip was firm. His eyes were clear. 17 physicians under investigation now. Estimated $43 million in denied or deliberately delayed care. You changed the system. Katie's throat had tightened to a point where words became dangerous. She nodded. The Afghan medic who'd tried to kill her in another life stood at the periphery of her vision, watching her with the expression of someone who'd finally understood redemption. Around them, the waiting room had returned to its ambient noise, but different now. Everyone knew. The timid nurse who'd been suspiciously absent, who'd been suspended for insubordination, who'd cried at the vending machine, she'd been a captain. She'd been a warrior. She'd been holding St. Michael's together while institutional corruption tried to tear it apart. 6 weeks later, Colonel Brennan's wife Angela drove through downtown Raleigh and spotted a blue and white medical supply delivery van turning onto Elm Street. The driver was thin-faced, disheveled, with the look of a man whose life had been reduced to minimum wage and legal fees. Dr. Pierce had surrendered his license. Federal sentencing was scheduled for the following month. 2 years minimum, the prosecutors had agreed. The pharmaceutical company faced a class action lawsuit from military families across 3 states. The strategic competence that had terrified Katie had become the architecture of his own destruction. Meanwhile, at St. Michael's, the renovated pediatric wing glowed with new equipment and fresh paint. The equipment Katie had wanted to order for Michael's imaging. The supplies that would have been immediately available if bureaucratic cruelty hadn't delayed them. At the entrance, a bronze plaque gleamed under the overhead lights, the Captain Katie Rodriguez Children's Emergency Unit, dedicated to the principle that every child deserves a champion, regardless of insurance coverage or rank. Katie stood in dress uniform for the first time at the hospital, her decorations catching the light, the bronze star, the purple hearts, the ribbons that represented decisions made under fire and people saved who would have died otherwise. Her son Danny stood beside her in his Sunday clothes, finally old enough to understand why some mothers came home crying in the middle of the afternoon, why some missions couldn't be explained, why some debts could only be repaid by saving one more child. She reached into her jacket as the ceremony ended, feeling the faded unit patch from the 82nd Combat Support Hospital still sewn into the lining. The threads were warm but holding. Some missions never really ended. Some debts transcended time and distance and rank. Some people never stopped being warriors, even when they wore scrubs and carried stethoscopes instead of rifles. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. That's Katie's story. And if it moved you, if it reminds you that heroes walk among us, sometimes in the quietest uniforms, sometimes asking nothing for what they give, then hit that like button and subscribe. Because there are more stories coming. More people who sacrificed everything and asked for nothing. And they deserve to be remembered.